Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Junko Takekawa, Senior Arts Program Officer of Japan Foundation, London. Thank you for joining this online talk event, Kikuko Tsumura, Live in Conversation. This event is presented in partnership with the Times and the Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival, which is currently on in Cheltenham. We have seen a surge of interest in Japanese contemporary literature, and then Japan Foundation, keeping abreast of the trend in the UK and Japan, has delivered various literature-related events alone or in partnership with other organizations. We are very delighted to work with the Cheltenham Literature Festival, our like-minded partner, and present two authors from Japan in the frame of new writing from Japan. They are Ms. Kikuko Tsumura and Mr. Keiichiro Hirano. I'm sure some of you who are attending for this session have already watched that pre-recording interview with them, and today's session is a kind of follow-up, and it's live, so you can ask your burning questions on the virtual Q&A session. If you haven't watched the session yet, don't worry. You can still catch it on the festival YouTube, and we will let you know the access link through the chat box so you can catch it up later. For this first live session with Japanese author, we have invited Ms. Kikuko Tsumura, the author of There's No Such a Thing as an Easy Job. The English translated version was published by Bloomsbury in November 2020, translated by Polly Barton. This is the Japanese version of Kikuko's book. As you will hear quite a lot about the work by Ms. Tsumura from herself, I'm not going to go into the detail or let alone the spoiler, but award-winning novelist Ms. Tsumura, whose work tend to rotate around the life of young people or their working life, in particular that of female workers, has gained passionate fans in Japan. There's No Such a thing as an Easy Job also received many good reviews in the UK, including from Financial Times, saying an irrelevant but thoughtful voice with light echoes of Haruki Murakami. The book is uncannily timely, a novel as smart as it's quite funny. Thank you so much for your time joining us. The acclaim owes also hugely to the translator, Polly Barton, her experience and mastery of translating Japanese literature. Polly is a great contributor to the popularity of Japanese literature in the UK, translating numerous books and pieces, including Spring Gardens by Tomoka Shibazaki. She's joining Ms. Tsumura and will review the translation practice behind There's No Such a Thing as an Easy Job. Thank you, Polly. Lastly, but perhaps more importantly, I'd like to welcome Kate Griffin, Associate Program Director at the National Center for Writing, who has agreed to moderate a session. She's no stranger to Japanese literature and has worked in the international scene, and she has been involved in a collaboration on a number of Japan-related projects. Thank you, Kate. Next, housekeeping matters. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using a webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you to keep your audio and video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function to send in your question at any time. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Remember, the attendee's question may be seen by everyone else, so that you can upvote a particular question placed by another person which you would like answered, or if it is the same as yours. Simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to time restrictions, we may not be able to pick up all the questions you asked, so my apologies in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you the online questionnaire, so please spare the short moment to complete it for our future event. That's all from me. Now, I'd like to hand it over to our panels, Kate, Polly, and then 津村さん。よろしくお願いします。津村さん、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much, Junko, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's event. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Kikuko Tsumura and Polly Barton. As Junko mentioned, some of you may already have seen Tsumura-san in conversation earlier this week with Vicky Young, and if not, I'd really encourage you to watch it. But today, this is your chance to join in the conversation. I'll be opening up to questions from the audience later in the event. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box whenever they occur to you. First, we're going to talk about Kikuko Tsumura's novel, There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job. This is what the English translation looks like, translated into English by Polly Barton, also with us. I thought we'd start with a short reading. Tsumura-san, could you tell us a bit about the book and about the extract that you've chosen to read for us, please?
はい、この本は、36歳のバーンアウト症候群で一つ目の仕事をドロップアウトした女性が、5つの仕事を渡り歩く、1年間の間に5つの仕事を渡り歩くという小説です。
This is a novel about a 36-year-old lady who has suffered from burnout and dropped out of the workforce, but now she's back and she spends a year going from one job to another and experiences 4 jobs in all over the course of the novel.
朗読する箇所というのは5つ目の仕事、最後の仕事なんですけれども、そこで公演の見張りをする仕事なんですけれども、そこでの上司との会話です。
This extract comes from her 5th and final job, where she is a lookout in a park, and it's a conversation with her boss.
Thank you. Would you like to read from the extract? And I meant to say thank you very much to Bethan Jones as well for the wonderful interpretation for this event. But yes, time for the reading.
失礼します。でもね、フリーペーパーがめくられていた件についてはどう思われます？風邪でしょう。窓は閉めてましたよ。隙間風が入るんですよ、あの小屋は。私もあそこで勤務してたことがあるんでわかります。箱田さんは寒い寒いとでも言いたげに腕を組む。それに読んではったのは ODP マガジンでしょ。あれめっちゃ軽いやないですか。私も好きなんでよう読んでますけど、うちの家の襖が閉まるときに出るぐらいの風で飛んでたことありますよ。箱田さんの妙にリアリティのある話に私はたじたじとなる。箱田さんは悪い人ではないし、むしろいい人だと思う。仕事を愛しているし、この公園を愛している。でも手強い。安心して働いてください。そう言って箱田さんはサムズアップする。私も思わず、おうと言いながら親指を立てかけるのだが、さすがにそこまでお人よしでもないので、何かあったら今度はトランシーバーで連絡しますからね、と釘を刺すにとどめる。箱田さんは、それはどんとこいですわ、と腹を叩く。何なのだこのやりとりは。言葉の上ではゆるゆるなのだが、私と箱田さんの間には一種の強烈な緊張状態があったと思う。私は箱田さんに負けたのだ。以上です。
Thank you very much. Polly is now going to read the English translation.
Thank you. Thank you to Tsumura-san for that reading. So as Tsumura-san explained, this extract is from the 5th and final job in the book, which is entitled The Easy Job in the Hut in the Big Forest. And just for context, so the protagonist is talking to her boss, Mr. Hakota, and in the hut where she's working, there have been some slightly unusual goings on, and fear that there might be some kind of intruder, and a magazine that she has left out in the hut has had its pages mysteriously turned when she comes back. And that's what this conversation centers on. But what do you make of the pages being turned? I guess that was the wind's doing. The windows were closed. But the breeze gets in through the cracks in that hut. I worked there for a time myself, so I know. Mr. Hakata clasped his arms to his chest, staging a pantomime of how freezing it was. Besides, you said it was the ODP magazine you were reading, right? That's very flimsy. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan, and I never miss an issue. But sometimes at home, it goes flying when I so much as close the sliding screen doors. There was something I found overwhelming about this little speech of Mr. Hakata's, crammed full as it was of convincing detail. He wasn't a bad person. In fact, he was on the good side of personhood. He loved his job and he loved this part, but he was rather forceful in his opinions. Don't worry about it. You're safe, he said, giving me a thumbs up. Okay, I began, as the tip of my thumb started to lift itself up in imitation, but at the last second I decided that I wasn't that much of a pushover and instead added, if anything else happens, I'll be in touch on the walkie-talkie. Anytime, he said, thumping his lower back. What an odd interaction, I reflected. The words we were saying sounded so even-tempered, but I had felt a fierce tension running between us. It was clear to me. I had lost to Mr. Hamilton. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you both very much for those readings. Tsumura-san, during your conversation with Vicky Young, you said that you were fed up with writing about people. And so this novel, you wanted to write about work. The protagonist does 5 jobs that are somewhat unusual. And to give anyone who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet an idea of this, I'll read out the 5 jobs, as each chapter is dedicated to one of those jobs. They are the surveillance job, the bus advertising job, the cracker packet job, the postering job, and the easy job in the hut in the big forest. You said in the conversation with Vicky that you had chosen these jobs as they were ones that you would like to try yourself. Have you tried any of them yourself? And were there any other jobs that you considered including in the novel?
これらの仕事については私は一度もやったことがなくて、自分がやりたいと思った仕事について全部想像で書きました。別の仕事があったかっていうことについてなんですけど、ちょっと考えはしたと思うんですけれども、やっぱりこの5つの仕事で一本の小説を書こうということに最終的に落ち着いて、かなり初期の方に落ち着いて、でそのまま書いたと思います。
I've never done any of these jobs. They were jobs that I wanted to try, but I wrote them all from my imagination. As for whether there were any other jobs that I considered, I'm sure that there were, but these were the 5 that I settled on for the story.
Thank you. And which was your favourite of the 5 jobs? Did you have a favourite?
一番やってみたい仕事は、森の中の小屋での簡単な仕事です。
The one that I would most like to do is the easy job in the hut in the big forest.
It does sound a very lovely job to do, especially in these times when we appreciate the open air so much more. Tsumura-san, you also said that burnout is a big thing for the protagonist, as might well be the case for any 36-year-old Japanese working woman. In fact, the novel touches on various social issues in Japan. not just burnout, but depression, loneliness, and cults. Were these issues that you particularly wanted to explore in the novel?
そうですね。特に、うつ病とかカルトとか孤独についてを主題にしようとは思ってなかったんですけれども、仕事について36歳の女性が仕事をすることについて小説を書こうと思ったら、憂鬱さであったりとか、自分を励ましてくれる存在が近くにいないとか、仕事とか孤独の苦しみにつけ込んできて誰かを操ろうとする人々について書くことは、自分についてはとても自然なことでした。わざわざその主題として選ぼうとしなくても、もうその小説を書く上でついてくることでした。
I think even if I didn't set out to write about depression and cults and loneliness as the main topic of my novel, I think in the course of writing about a 36-year-old woman's working life, it was inevitable that I would touch on things like feeling depressed, like having no one around you to encourage you, like being caught up in work and feeling lonely and taking that out on other people. I think even if I didn't choose to make these the theme of my novel, it was natural that they were going to feature in there.
Thank you. I have there are some questions in the Q&A. There's one that I thought would be good to bring in at this point from Derek Barretto, which asks, Kikuko, how closely do you relate to the main character?
そうですね。私自身はこの主人公ほど仕事はできないと思いますし、共感はしますけれども、私自身というわけではないと思います。一人の36歳の仕事ができる人の、自分が知っている中での平均的な像のようなものがこの主人公です。
I don't think I could work as hard as she does. I do empathize with her, but she's not me. She is maybe my average impression of a 36-year-old hardworking woman.
Thank you. And Alison Fincher is asking, it seems like the protagonist finds herself using her skills as a social worker more and more in each successive job. Is that intentional?
そうですね。実は主人公がソーシャルワーカーだっていうのは最後の方に決まったことなので、いつ決まったか思い出せないんですけれども、そうですね、3話目ぐらいでは決まってたと思うんですけれども、でそうですね、意図的には、彼女がソーシャルワーカーだ、元ソーシャルワーカーだっていうのを意識しませんでしたけれども、もう5話目の時点ではすでに彼女の前の職業っていうのは決まっていましたので、それを話に、絡める形で書いています。
I didn't decide that she had been a social worker until quite late on. I can't remember exactly when, but I think it was around chapter 3 that I decided that was what she had been. So it's not intentional that I included her social work skills in her other jobs, but by the time I got to chapter 5, I had decided that was her former role, and so I wrote it into the story there.
Well, that's really interesting to hear the process of imagining. That leads nicely into the next question in the Q&A, which is from TK, asking what led you and inspired you to write this work?
基本的には最後の5つ目の仕事、大きな森での 小さな小屋での簡単な仕事っていうものが一番最初にできてきて、でそのことについて小説を書いてみたいというのが、小説を書き始める何年も前からありました。で、長編小説を書いてくださいという依頼があって、で森の仕事のことを書いてみたいけれども、ちょっと長くするのは難しいなってなって、で他4つ自分のしてみたい仕事って何かなっていうのを考えて、5つの仕事を1年で女の人、36歳の女の人がやるっていうのを、転々とするっていうことを書いてみようと思いました。
The first idea that I came up with was that of the fifth job, the easy job in the small hut in the big forest. And I'd had that idea several years ago. But then when this commission came along to write a novel, that was what I wanted to write about, but it was hard to stretch that story out to the length of a full novel. So I started wondering what other jobs I might like to try so that I could feature, and I came up with these other 4 jobs that the protagonist, this 36-year-old woman, would do in the course of a year.
One more question about work. Tsumura-san, your novel focuses on the lives of working women. Are you interested in writing, or have you written about women outside of work? Women when they're not working, or women when they don't work?
働いていない女性、主婦の女性ですね、専業主婦の女性については書いたことはあります。8人主人公、女性ばかりの主人公が8人いる長編小説というか短編連作を書いたことがあるんですけれども、その中の一人が専業主婦でした。で、そうですね、自分が働かなかったことが人生というか18歳じゃない、23歳以降働いていない期間というのがないので、ほとんど。だから専業主婦の女性のことを書くのはとても興味深かったですし、面白かったです。で、20歳以下の、10代の子供についてはよく書くので、働いていない女性のことを書かないというわけではないです。
In terms of women not working, I have written about a housewife. I wrote a series of short stories with 8 different female protagonists, and one of them was a housewife. I myself have never not worked, so it was very interesting for me to write about someone like that. I have written a lot about girls in their teens. So in that sense, I've written about women not working.
I'm going to bring Polly into the conversation in a minute, but an anonymous attendee has just asked a question that I think would fit very well at this point. They ask, do you feel that there is a more vocal movement against poor working conditions in Japanese culture at the moment? And do you feel a taboo against talking about conditions is being reversed? That was a question for Tsumura-san.
私への質問だと思ってました。動きですよね。そのひどい労働条件に対する動きはあるようでないですね。労働条件のことを問題にする人はたくさんいますけれども、そうですね、私がこの20年ぐらいの体感ですごく改善されたということはないです。
I suppose there's sort of a movement to improve working conditions, but on the other hand, not really. A lot of people see that there is a problem but I wouldn't say that it's improved that much over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Now, as promised, I'll bring Polly into the conversation to talk about the translation. I wanted to ask Polly how you came to translate the novel and whether you collaborated with Tsumura-san on the translation. There's also a question from Gary Ochiltree, who wants me to ask you your impressions when you first read the novel and saw the brilliant humour which you translate so well, and which we'll talk about in a minute. Polly.
Thank you. Yeah. So, you know, when I first became a translator, or was trying to become a literary translator, the kind of model for how one came to translate a novel was that you found, you know, you did your research and you found this brilliant novel that no one else had read from an author who hadn't been translated before. And you you would read it, and then you would translate a sample, and you would make a synopsis, and then you would pitch this to various people at various publishers, and you know, one of them would eventually agree that they would publish this book. And you know, after a few years of working as a translator, I sort of came to realize that either that happened far less than people said it did, or I was just extremely bad at it, but it just, that was not my experience. Everything that I translated was something, either the publisher came to me, or that it was a more kind of collaborative process. But actually, there's no such thing as an easy job, that dream model was exactly what happened. A friend of mine whose taste I very much appreciate, recommended Tsumura-san, and I went on online and was just kind of searching around and seeing what she'd written, and decided to go for this book to order first, just because I was really intrigued by this idea of a novel that was set entirely at work and that was just made up of 5 different jobs. And I sort of felt like, I don't think that can work. Like, I don't think that can be that interesting. So it was a kind of challenge, in a way, challenge to the book to be interesting. And sure enough, it was. Like, I really felt hooked pretty much from the first few pages. There was something about the voice and the tone that I just really loved, the way that it was very humorous and warm without being sort of too much. It felt like a kind of, it had a real companionableness to it. And yeah, I liked the way that each of the 5 chapters, each of the 5 jobs was a sort of job in an, you know, was a self-contained entity in a way, but they were also very much linked, and you know, you do see a progression between them. I should add, actually, just in relation to what Tsumura-san was saying earlier about, it was only from chapter 3 or so that she realized that the protagonist's initial job was as a social worker was that, for context, this book was initially serialized in a Japanese newspaper, as often happens with, or happens more commonly with Japanese novels than does here, I think. So in that sense, you know, once you've written the first chapter, it's kind of finalized, it's out there, it's like you can't go back and tinker with it too much. Yes, so that was how I came to be involved with it, and from that point I just started kind of, I worked quite hard on the sample, quite hard and quite long. You know, it took me quite a while to find a voice that I felt worked in English, and then once I had that, I shipped it around to various people that I knew, and it finally found a home at Bloomsbury, which was really not what I was expecting, but was, you know, amazing.
That's great. And thank you, Polly. There's a question for you from anonymous attendee. Are the problems that the protagonist faces universal, in your opinion? Did you have any problems translating in that sense?
That's an interesting question.
Hmm.
I suppose I don't see them as universal, no. In the sense that there's something that everyone experiences. I don't think that that is the case, but I also don't see them as culturally specific or specific to Japan. I mean, you know, I think Japan is quite well known in the Western world as like maybe having rather extreme working conditions, but I don't think that that's fundamentally different from the way that a lot of people work in New York and London, say. And, you know, similarly, this sort of impulse to maybe excessive diligence or like workaholism, I think is something, you know, everyone around me sort of struggles with in a way, or is, you know, in a relationship with someone who's sort of struggling with that stuff. So yeah, I think they're relatively universal issues within the first world. And then I also think that there's something very relatable about the protagonist. You know, I don't think, I feel like she has a sort of a character that it's very easy for most people to empathize with. That was one thing.
Yeah, there are a few questions in the Q&A for you, but I'd just like to ask you about, following on from what you're saying about voice, because in the English translation of the novel, even though the protagonist is unnamed, I really did feel like I was listening to a story told to me by a friend who's funny, warm, confiding. Was this your experience when you were reading the novel in Japanese? And when you were translating the novel, how did you carry over that distinctive voice? Were there any aspects that needed tweaking?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I don't think I'd entirely formulated this until your question, but I think one of the things that I liked most about the experience of reading it in the Japanese was that sense of closeness and kind of, yeah, confiding, that there's the distance between the reader and the narrator / protagonist is not large. And yeah, there's an intimacy there, which often kind of comes across through this sort of slightly, if not necessarily outrightly funny or sarcastic, then at least sort of just humor, like invested with sort of humor or tongue-in-cheekness. And so, yeah, for that reason, it really felt like making this book successful in English meant getting that voice right. The question of like what that looks like in English is a really interesting one, and it's, you know, it's quite curious to me that I find it quite hard to elucidate what that looks like, because I worked on it for months, and like what was I doing during that time? Was I changing things? I don't think things are massively changed in terms of content, but it's about hitting on this place of like, what does this character speak like in English? You know, it's not, it doesn't feel like to me changing something. It's more like getting rid of the extraneous matter until you kind of find the shape of how this person would speak, how this character would speak to me if they were speaking English rather than Japanese. Yeah.
It's Tsumura-san, when you hear Polly talking about your protagonist and the way she describes her, is this what you intended? Does it sound like your version of the protagonist?
はい、そうですね。私自身は自分の小説に関して、自分の小説の主人公を友達が話しているように自分の小説を読んでもらえるのが一番嬉しいっていうふうに思うんで、ポリさんの話を聞いててすごく自分のそのいうかな、自分のその願望っていうのは結構叶えられてるんだなっていうふうに嬉しく思いました。
Well, I like it best when my protagonists feel like they're talking to me, feel like my friends. So I'm actually really happy to hear Polly's description because it seems like that has worked.
Yeah, I'm glad you're both in agreement. It sounds like the voice has carried over. On the English translation, there's a quote from Charlene Teo, the novelist, who says of this novel that it is quietly hilarious and deeply attuned to the uncanny rhythms and deadpan absurdity of the daily grind. Tsumura-san, did you set out to make the novel funny on purpose?
はい、私自身はユーモアをその前面に押し出してで主題にできるような技術はない作家だっていうふうに思いますけれども小説を毎日書いている孤独な自分を楽しませる程度にはユーモアを含んだ小説が書けていればなと思って書いていました。それが結果的にその小説を読む人たちにユーモアがあるっていうふうに感じていただけるんでしたらとても嬉しく思います。
I don't think I really have the technique to write a comic novel per se, but what I do try to do is to keep it interesting for myself and to entertain myself as I'm writing, spending every day by myself writing. And if the readers feel that humor coming across, then I'm happy about that.
I'm glad the novel entertained you to write as much as it entertained us to read it. It was great fun. Polly, translating humor, it's notoriously difficult. Did you have to make any changes to make the humor work in English? And do you have any examples of that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the ideal thing with translating humor, and I mean like outright humor rather than the sort of general humorous tone, which is another thing entirely. The ideal is when it just like there's an equivalent thing in English that sort of magically works or whatever. But unfortunately, that is not always the case. And so that, at that point, then there is a judgment call of whether you replicate the Japanese quite closely and lose the humor, or whether you maintain the humor and lose that kind of closeness to the original. So this book, chapter 2, is the bus announcements job. So there are the scripts of various bus announcements, sort of adverts that are broadcast on this bus called the Albatross. And a lot of them, as would be the case in, as we find in radio adverts in the UK, for example, like use sort of cheesy puns or like things that aren't really even funny, but sort of riffing off things, off word choices. And so like I've got a couple of examples here. There is one where for a estate agent called Maruyama Holmes, and on their billboards they have a gorilla, and the end of this advert, the final word in Japanese is uho uho, which has two meanings. It's the sound that a gorilla makes, and it's also a sound of being very, happy, like it's a sound of glee. And with that, it's like, well, what on earth do you do with that in English? In my first few drafts, I had like joyful grunting going on, and then I sort of was talking to my editor, and we just said, like, we need to work, this needs to be funny in English. It needs to be really cheesy and really funny. And so in the end, that was one of the kind of occasions where I changed it relatively dramatically. So the final line in the English now reads, "The gorilla on our billboard would be so AP if you stopped by." So, it's sort of, you're still getting the happiness, the glee, and also the gorilla link, but it's just transposed into a different way of representing that. And then there's another advert for the Takayama ear and nose clinic, and what happens here is something which we find often in Japanese. So there will be specific references to the Chinese characters that are being used, and so the take of Takayama means bamboo, and the last line of this advert is, "You'll know us by the big tree in our garden. Our name means bamboo, but our tree is a pine." And it's not funny, but it's not desperately funny in Japanese. And I felt like that was one of those situations where I could add in a little bit of extra information in English, but quite kind of preserve it, and sort of, for me, it's still, it has that slightly annoying thing that radio adverts have, that like that kind of itchy, not quite funny tone. And so like that, I chose to preserve that.
Thanks. There are a couple of related questions in the Q&A. Tony Malone wants to know, Polly, was there anything you found difficult about translating this novel? I mean, the humor is one thing. And then Yuka Harada-Pa asks, from Tsumura-san's reading, I noticed a character is using Kansai accents. I am a translator as well, and I am very curious how Polly treated dialect and accent into English. Sometimes I feel some strong Tohoku accent cannot be ignored, and I've tried to use Geordie, for example, to express the atmosphere. So yeah, difficult things to translate, and I suspect that dialect and accent might be part of that.
I mean, this is, I suppose, not entirely unrelated to the humour question, but in the third job, the rice cracker packets job, so the protagonist has a job writing the trivia that appears on the back of rice cracker packets, and there's different kinds of trivia, so different sort of series, and a couple of those were funny, so that like there was the humour thing with that, but there was also a couple that are very Japanese specific. So there was one about explaining the meaning of the Chinese characters commonly used in people's names. And then there was also one about like Japanese words that people might not know the origin of or know exactly kind of what they were about. And in the beginning stages of, it's this funny thing of like, when I first read this book, I was just so in love with it and was so excited about the idea of translating it. And then it, a year later, it was actually happening. And then it's like, suddenly you realize, oh my God, now I really actually have to find a solution to this, thing. Like, how am I going to do this in English? And so I was, considering all of these different ways that I could deal with these names, the characters in the names, and so on and so forth. And then, eventually, the reasoning that I came to is this book is very clearly set in Japan. It's very obvious to the reader, not just from this, but from other things, that the language being spoken is Japanese. So altering, the bits where particular Japanese phrases are being explained, transposing that into English is going to be weird. And so in the end, I, like, for the ones explaining the Japanese phrases, I just kept them as explaining Japanese phrases, and I added in a little bit, I simplified it and added in a little bit more explanation for the English reader. But like my editor, let me keep the Japanese characters. And similarly with the names, I just explained the Chinese characters. And, that's one of those cases where I think that I was thinking so many difficult things about it. And in the end, it was actually, I don't know, it made most sense to sort of translate relatively faithfully what was there, and not to localize. But obviously that doesn't work for everything, and it definitely doesn't work for humor. The dialects question is a difficult one. Again, it's one that lots of people have spoken about and written about, and there's kind of changing tides, I think, in people's thinking about it. I personally don't feel like it is appropriate to use dialects that are specific to a particular region of the UK or of an English-speaking nation, because, for example, in this novel, we know that we're in Japan, and we know that he's from Kansai. So if he is suddenly very noticeably Geordie or from Manchester, for me, there's too many connotations from that area that come in. At the same time, Mr. Hakota is a very, he has a lot of character, and I wanted to convey that. So what I attempted to do was make his English quite kind of idiosyncratic without being tied to any specific region. And I also, I can't remember exactly. My sense is that it doesn't say in the Japanese that he's from Kansai, because it's so obvious that he's speaking Kansai dialect. So I think I added in an explanation saying he was, he had a strong Kansai accent or something to that effect, so that people who are familiar with, readers who are familiar with Kansai would know that was what was going on.
Yeah, I've just got one more question for you from Alison Fincher, who asks if you could talk about your choice to use Britishisms in your translations.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this as I was talking then, because that I was saying that it doesn't work. I don't think it works to tie English to any specific geographical region, right? But at the same time, I'm also aware that that's exactly what I'm doing, because I am translating into British English. but that really is all that I can do. You know, I feel like, you know, not all translators feel like this, and some editors encourage translators to translate into something that they call mid-Atlantic English, which is, you know, English that doesn't have the sort of characteristics particularly of, or doesn't use specifically British or American or Australian, etc. idioms. But my feeling with this was that in order to do it justice, I needed to use kind of everything I had at my disposal, and that really is the British idiom. And so that is how I work, I suppose. You know, and then if and when my work is published in the US, for example, I'm perfectly amenable to kind of having a conversation with the American editors, if, you know, if they want to change things or make things sort of more mid-Atlantic, that's okay. But I feel that for me, I don't want to sort of take the edge off my own translation. And, you know, I have tried to translate into American English before, and I think done quite a bad job. So translating into British English basically is just the way that I work best, I suppose.
Thank you. There's a question now about translation for Tsumura-san from Katerina Maza, who asks, Tsumura-san's novel was recently published also in Italian and is receiving a lot of interest. I am curious to know whether Tsumura-san had in mind that her book would have readers in other parts of the world while she was writing it, and what effect it has on her to know that her work is also being read outside the Japanese context. Tsumura-san.
はい、一度も考えたことがなかったです。小説を書いている間、自分の小説が日本語以外に翻訳されるっていうことは全く考えずに好き勝手に日本のドメスティックなギャグみたいなのをいっぱい入れてて、話を聞いてて申し訳なく思いました。
It never crossed my mind as I was writing this that it would be translated into any other languages. So I just threw in all the Japanese, play puns that I could, and listening to Polly speak, I really feel I should apologize to her.
I'm sure Polly enjoys the challenge of translating. There is another question for you, Tsumura-san, about translation from Alison Fincher, who said, "There's no such thing as an easy job. It's one of my favorite books. Are there other upcoming works from Ms. Tsumura in English translation? The short story collection that she mentioned, for example. So Tsumura-san, do you have other books coming out in English translation?"
私ですか。ないです。本としてはないですけれども、ポリーさんが時々フユーレブラジルっていう幽霊の話であったりとか、そうですね。で、その前に給水塔と亀っていう小説を訳していただいたりとか、あとちょっと前に地獄っていう小説があるんですけれども、それも訳していただいたんで、少しずつ進んでいったら何かにはなるんじゃないかなとはうっすら思っています。
No plans for a book translation at the moment, but Polly has translated some of my short stories, A Ghost in Brazil, and The Water Tower and the Turtle, and before that, one called Hell. So maybe there's hope. I do hold out a faint hope that there might be more.
Are these short stories available to read Polly, were they for a magazine or?
So, A Ghost in Brazil is available to read on Granta, as is The Water Tower and the Turtle. Hell is coming out in the upcoming edition of Monkey, whose theme is travel. So this is, a trip to hell. It's a really wonderful story, so I would recommend people checking that out. Yeah, and they are all from the same story collection. So my hope is that one day we can publish that as a collection. That would be great. I would love to translate more things by Tsumura-san. So yes, hopefully there will be things, but there's nothing imminent on the horizon.
Great, so we should check out Granta and Monkey. I have a question for Tsumura-san that one of the audience has also mentioned. Mike Raggett says there are a number of surreal elements. Were they planned or did they just pop up as you were writing? My question is really, I was struck by how the supernatural recurs throughout, from the mention of fixed and freely floating ghosts to shops that mysteriously appear and then vanish again. Tsumura-san, is the supernatural part of everyday life in Japan? And as Mike asks, did you plan to include these elements or did they just pop up as you were writing?
はい、すいません。そうですね。もともと最初からシュールな小説にしようっていう意図もなくて、ただ書いてるうちにこうした方が面白いよなとかって、なんか自分を楽しませるように書いてたら、ああいう時々シュールの展開になっていったっていうのが、最終的にはそうなりました。で、そうですね。日本人は結構幽霊話みたいなのが好きで、多分ですけど、他の国の人のことはよくわからないですけれども、だから幽霊とか超常現象の話を結構日本人でするなとは思います。で、気配とか雰囲気みたいなものをすごく日本人って敏感に感じてて、で不思議なものとか不気味なものが結構日本人って好きだなっていうのが私自身も思ってて、で私自身もやっぱり幽霊の話とかが好きなので、何か理解できないことがあったら幽霊じゃないとかすぐ言っちゃうっていうようなことが第5話で出てくるんですけれども、そういうことを書きたいと思いました。全部を論理でこう割り切ってしまうんじゃなくて、すぐ幽霊じゃないとかって言ってしまうようななんて言ったらいいかな、カジュアルに言ってしまう感じを書きたいなと思いました。
I never set out to write anything surreal, but I think as I was writing, I was just trying to entertain myself and make it more interesting, and occasionally it would take a turn for the surreal because of that. Japanese people love ghost stories. I don't know how it is in other countries, but we do like ghosts and the supernatural. We're very sensitive to atmosphere and to signs, and we like things that are a bit strange and ominous. I love ghost stories myself, and we tend to, if we can't explain something, we'll go for the ghost explanation quite quickly, as you see in the 5th story in the book. And I think I wanted to show that the way that we don't always go for a logical explanation, but we'll quite casually suggest that something might have been caused by a ghost.
Thank you. And Polly, were there challenges for you in sharing this aspect of Japanese life with English language readers?
I don't think so. I don't think this was a challenge. I think this I could just pretty much carry over. what was written in the Japanese, but it was definitely one of the things that I loved about this book from the first time I read it. And I think, you know, we've used the word supernatural, but I think it's like, it sort of sits on the cusp of like, is it supernatural or is it not? It's yeah, like Tsumura-san said, it's kind of ominous. And I think that is it, isn't it, that kind of pervades all of the stories was really great for me. And it also speaks a lot to, I think, a slightly different perception of ghosts and the supernatural that exists in Japan, and is, you know, maybe sort of informed by a more animist religion, where, you know, I think in the West we have a very, you know, something is a ghost or it isn't, and we have a very fixed idea of what a ghost or a spirit looks like. Whereas I think in Japan it's more of a gradated scale. You know, there's a sort of greater porousness between life and death, essentially, and this world and the next. And you know, there's something that I find endlessly wonderful about the sort of casualness of it. And, you know, I've translated this another book by a different author, Where the Wild Ladies Are, by Matsuda Aoko. And you know, one of the wonderful things about that for me as well is like the way that it's not this kind of weird, spooky, oh my gosh, there's a ghost. It's like very sort of spirits, either human spirits or you know, tree spirits or whatever, are kind of inhabiting our worlds with great casualness, and there's not a huge sort of song and dance about it. And so I suppose, to return to the original question, like when I was translating, the thing that I just wanted to very much avoid doing was like flagging that element of the book up more than it is in the Japanese, because I think it's the kind of understatedness of it and the fact that it isn't like, look, something weird and spooky is happening here, that is what makes it successful, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time, so audience, if you have any burning questions that you want to ask either Tsumura-san or Polly before we finish, please put them in the Q&A now. There's rather an appropriate question for Tsumura-san from Kikuko Ishiwaki, who says, do you always know the ending of your novels?
決まっている場合と決まっていない場合があって、決めて書くとか決めないで書くっていうのは決めていません。で、そうです。この世に対する仕事はないは、そうですね。書きながら決めた小説だっていうふうには思います。
I sometimes know the ending and I sometimes don't. And I don't decide which it's going to be. I think there's no such thing as an easy job. I wrote it as I went along.
Yeah, I'm interested in the editing process and kind of how the novel moved from being serialized to being published in book form. Tsumura-san, do you edit as you go along? And did you make any changes to the novel when it moved from being serialized to being published as a book in Japanese?
Ah, 聞こえません。はい。そうですね。あまり本にするときに内容を変えたりすることはないですので、書きながら編集していると思います。
Yes, I think I tend to edit as I write, but I don't think anything really major needs to be changed content-wise when it goes from a serial to being a book.
I think maybe this is something that I'm not supposed to reveal, but something that's maybe interesting to point out at this point is that, like, in Japan, I think this is mostly seen as, or it's like listed on Amazon as linked stories or interconnected stories. And when I was talking to my editor at Bloomsbury, she was like, no, I mean, we're going to market this as a novel. Like, it can't, in an English speaking world, it can't be anything other than a novel. But that's sort of and I'd actually forgotten about that until sort of just speaking about it today. But it's sort of interesting that, you know, what coming and going between those two different ways of conceptualizing this work as kind of fundamentally shifts something in a way. I sort of wonder what Tsumura-san was thinking, how she conceived of it as she was writing.
そうですね。私は実はその長編を書くのが苦手なんです。でも長編の依頼も来るんですね。1年間このウェブの欄で小説を書いてくださいみたいな。で自分は長編を書くのが苦手なんでどうしたらいいか考えるんですけれども、中編の連作なら書けるとか、そういう形で書いていきますね。
I'm not actually good at writing full-length novels, but I get commissioned to write them. So I'd have to write a novel to be serialized on such and such a website over the course of a year. So it's a struggle for me to know how to write something that long. But I thought if I write a series of interlinked shorter stories, then that will take me the full length.
Thank you both. We've run out of time. We've got time for just one last question. And Trixie Beato has asked rather a nice question for us to end on for Tsumura-san. She said, Tsumura-san, thank you for writing this novel. I greatly enjoyed reading this novel. What is the one thing that you hope readers take away from your novel?
It's
a tricky one.
そうですね。なんかな、仕事に疲れて味方がいないって感じたらこの本を読んでって、そういうことですかね。仕事に疲れたりとか自分は一人だと思ったらこの人も仕事をしてこの小説の主人公もあがいているので一人じゃないってこの本を読んで一人じゃないって感じてくださいって思います。
I think I would like people who are tired of working or who feel alone to read this book and realize that they're not the only ones struggling and that they're not alone.
Thank you. That's a lovely note to end on. As I said, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and to the Japan Foundation and the Cheltenham Literature Festival for hosting us. Thank you very much to Kikuko Tsumura and to Polly Barton for sharing their thoughts with us about this wonderful novel, and to Bethan Jones for her excellent interpretation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just giving that a very final note that I just want to convey my sincere thanks to all of you, your panels, Kate and Polly and Tsumura-san, of course, and Bethan. Sorry, I should have mentioned who you are in the beginning, but I was a little bit panicked in the beginning. Anyway, that was very interesting. I'm sure that everybody enjoyed it. And then I was very impressed by that geographical location where you live. From United States, Australia, and Romania, Dundee, Edinburgh, all over the world. So I'm very, very happy. It's actually proven that there's a lot of fan for Tsumura-san's book, and then I sincerely hope that Polly, or maybe other sort of challenging against Polly, who want to actually translate Tsumura-san's book, I highly encourage you to come forward. Anyway, I need to share one image. I try to share, but I can't really share for some reason, so I don't know why. But so I will actually mention it. As I said, on 16th of October, we have another author, Mr. Keiichiro Hirano, who has a very different style of writing, different kind of storytelling, to come on to that Zoom talk. So it's 16th of October, 1 o'clock in the UK time on the Zoom. That's a space is still available. So if you want to join, just check out on the Eventbrite. Thank you so much for joining us. And then I hope that you will watch that Tsumura-san's pre-recording session once again. And if you haven't read the book, please take up and read and enjoy yourself. Thank you so much, everyone. So have a nice afternoon. Thank you.